This over here is RTX 5070. And if you're wondering if this is any good for creators, you're in the right place. But there's a lot of buts. There's some good news, but there's also bad news. In fact, you might have seen the bad news, but I'll promise you this, it's even worse. When preparing for this video, I actually wanted to understand what exactly is going on. And I found some very interesting things that I don't see other reviewers talk about. And here I am trying to explain this to you so that you would know exactly what's going on in terms of the naming, the shortage of GPUs, what exactly is happening. Let's talk. It's so annoying. I don't want to pay hundreds of dollars to just change my Windows wallpaper just because my Windows isn't licensed. Well, why don't you try hookies? That's a ton cheaper. And if you use the code TN20, you get it even cheaper. What do you mean? How do I get it and how is it possible? Well, see this video here, or the one you're watching. Click in the link on the video description, add the Windows 11 CD product to the cart, proceed to checkout, add the code TN20 for the extra discount. So what, the Windows 11 Pro OEM key is just $23.22? Yeah. Choose the preferred payment option and complete the purchase. The key will be available on the purchased orders in a few moments. Copy the key and paste it into your Windows activation settings, and you're all done. Well, that was easy. Is that Ryan Gosling? No. Anyway, by the way, the same discount code also works website-wide, so go check out other products, maybe like Microsoft Office. Now, you've already noticed that I've got a lot of different GPUs in here. I want to talk about that first. I've got this Zotac Solid RTX 4070 here, and in terms of design, it is actually skinny. It's small. As you can see, they've really trimmed it down to literally 2 slots, which means that you can see a lot of the 5070s shrink down in size, even though the power increase has gone up. So looking at the 4070 Super here from Gigabyte, you can see it's quite a bit bigger. It's thicker. In terms of the length, it's kind of the same, but it's quite a bit beefier. The good news in terms of design is when we look at the 4070 from Zotac, so this is not the Super, this is just 4070. It's bigger. The design, I think, looks worse. Looks a bit of a lower quality. Everything is not as good as I would say on the newer one. You can see rigid build that go all the way around compared to the previous design where fans have been put on the top. But then if you look at the 3070 here, that looks quite tiny compared to the rest of them. And interestingly, this 16-pin design, actually in that point it wasn't 16-pin, it was just 12. The 16, the other 4 pins got added later. It was quite a bit different. Look at the fan designs on this side. The Zotac new one is very, very nice. Obviously the Founders Edition, nice as well. In terms of buying for it, it's all right, but it seems to run quite a bit worse in terms of temperature compared to the other cards out there. Look at the designs of the new Zotac. I'm loving it a lot. And if we're looking at the back panel design, again, it's a lot more minimal. I love that the live to game slogan is gone. It is more minimal, like a 2-color design. Previously we had like a lot of different colors and then RGB going in there. There is a little bit of RGB on this Zotac as well. As you can see from the B-roll, this RGB lights up on the side there. Compared to the 4070 Super, the Gigabyte looks absolutely insanely big. Interestingly, they have shrunk the PCB size down on the newer one. You can see the 5070 compared to the 4070 is shorter and there's a bigger pass-through compared to the previous one. That's good news. Now, before we go into the benchmarks, I want to explain something that was very confusing to me, and I haven't seen this explained on the internet yet. The naming scheme for this is very, very odd. And you'll see that when we are looking at the actual specs. So what you can see here is RTX 4070, 3070, so the previous generation, 4070 Super, 5070, and 5070 Ti. So you can kind of have a comparison where this kind of slots in. The GPU name, what you see on the first line, The 3070 is GA104, 4070 is AD104, the 4070 Super is AD104 as well, and then the RTX 5070 is GB205, the 5070 Ti is GB203. Now, this might be confusing to you, but let me explain how this works. So the numbers in there represents different GPU dies. When these chips come out from TSMC, so Nvidia buys wafers from TSMC. TSMC is based in Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. That's what this stands for. They have these wafers that are produced on this circle. And this little wafer, or the circle, you actually cut that down into different silicon sizes, like that. Pretend that they're all exactly the same size kind of squares. Which means that if you look at this bit in there and this one in here, they're not full squares, which means that you can't actually, use that part of it. These are just like off-cut. So there's a percentage of this that can be used. The bigger the dies, so each one of these in there, okay, that little X, what you can see there, if I just zoom in and show you this X in here, it's got X and Y in terms of millimeters. So let's say it is, I don't know, random 16 millimeters times 23 millimeters, for example. So that's square. And then each one of these squares, because of the different sizes, relates to the GPU name. GA104, AD104, AD104, GB205. So let's say this wafer in here is 205, which is the RTX 5070. Then they buy a different wafer from TSMC, okay? And that's cut down differently, okay? It's got bigger squares or dies. They're not always squares, they're different rectangles. And in here, this is called GB203. And on the specs, that's what the die size in millimeters represents, okay? And that 203 is actually an RTX 5080 and RTX 5070 Ti. They both use GB203, okay? So they get that square out, and then they want every one of these squares to become RTX 5080, because the 5080 costs more than 5070 Ti, so it's got better price. But the problem is, not all of these squares fully work. They've got defects in it. So let's say that you've got one of those rectangles and there is some kind of defect in there, and that part of the die can't be used. What happens is they turn parts of these cores, or some of these parts, off on the actual die, and then they sell this as RTX 5070 Ti, which costs less. As the manufacturing improves, then they have less and less defects, which means that they get a better yield on these squares. There's less of these in there and less defects somewhere all around these parts of the dies, and they can sell them better and better. As you can see, this was TSMC's 4nm node. What's weird in this is, if you look at the GB205, which is actually 263 millimeters square, it's not the same as the AD104, the previous generation RTX 4070 Super, which was 294 millimeters square. So as you can see, what is happening here between the different namings, they still call it RTX 5070. The node, or the actual die that they're getting from TSMC, is not the same size. It's not the same GPU in terms of size, especially when the 4nm node from TSMC hasn't changed. The 40 series equals 50 series in terms of that node. It's exactly the same. They've just built a different architecture on it. That's why when looking at the specs, you can see RTX 3070 has gone down from die size from 392 millimeters square to 294 millimeters square. As you can see, because going down from 8nm Samsung node to 4nm TSMC node, they can shrink the die size. They can make it smaller. Instead of being small, they make it smaller, because all these tiny little transistors inside there, they can fit more of them in, because in essence, the nanometer, they're smaller, so you can pack more transistors in a smaller square. Transistor, in essence, is basically just a switch. Now, when Nvidia calls the RTX 5070 GB205, that shows that we're actually not exactly 5070. It should be kind of like a 4060 Ti Super or something like that, because it's just not fully utilized it. If you look at the RTX 40 series, then the RTX 50 series should be called GB204. Yet there was no GB205 in the 40 series, which is weird. If you look at what's happened to the TDP, we're gone from 200 watts on the 4070 to 250 watts on the 5070. So basically, we're trying to get the same performance on a smaller die compared to what we had on the 4070 die, but yet crank up the power and then trying to get the same performance. Why is this so bad then, or so good? Now, Nvidia's pricing for the 5070, they show that it's gone down compared to the 4070. The 4070 was $599, yet the 5070 is $549. Now you think, oh, that's good. But actually it might not be enough because they're using considerably smaller GPU die there, which means that they get bought, like the raw material in the first place will cost less. I bet if you calculated all the smaller squares and then all the bigger squares that you get from wafer, you realize that you will make more money on the actual 5070 compared to the 4070. So business-wise, Nvidia is doing great schemes in here. Performance-wise, this is where things are getting not so good. Because when you look at the actual specs increase between generations, you can see that from 30 series, we got extra VRAM, 12 gigabytes. We went down in terms of the power consumption. From 40 to 50 series, we've gone up in power consumption, and there hasn't been really that big of a difference in VRAM. Yes, it is faster GDDR7 VRAM, but there is not more of them. And you know that the market demands more and more, especially when you look at competition from AMD. So I feel like Nvidia has been a little bit cheeky in the RTX 5070 here. It should not be called 5070. Especially when there's not that big of a difference between the previous generation. So you might be saying, why even release the 5070 series? Now, I've got a few different theories, but here's what, as is happening. I'm not sure if you knew that, but the 40 series stopped production in the end of last year. And because it's exactly the same chips, exactly the same manufacturing on the same process node or lithography, they're basically replacing their previous generation with a new generation, but not giving that much more performance, raw performance. They're banking on AI and, software, but the hardware, they're selling the same hardware for more expensive. What they will be buying this in from TSMC, obviously prices probably have increased a little bit in there as well. The generational increase hasn't increased. So 40 series is gone. Nvidia doesn't produce two separate generations at the same time. AMD and Intel, they still produce chips from last generation because they think we've got some left, so let's produce it all and sell it at the lower price point, because if you make any profit, that's that. Nvidia chooses to just make the latest series, 50 series, on the same production node. So it's kind of replacing the previous generation and not that much different hardware, what is actually happening there. So the 5070 really replaces the 4070 Super in production. Now, add to that mix Chinese New Year and all sorts of tariffs in the US, we get a shortage of GPUs. But Nvidia also wanted to sell all the stock of the 40 series, which means that if you don't give any new generation, you can still sell all your old stock at still the full price, because usually what happens, you and me know, the last generation gets sold at a lower price point when the new generation is out. But if you don't want to do that, just say that the new generation is launched, but there's no stock. Then people buy the old one at the elevated price point. Makes money for Nvidia, but it's bad for us. To make the matters worse, in some case better for us as creators, if you want a 50 series GPU, don't feel bad yet, because there is no support for most of the softwares out there. We don't have software support for Premiere Pro. Yes, it will work. You can edit video, but you're not going to get the full performance and the full benefit of the 50 series because those media engines aren't supported yet in Premiere Pro. The same for DaVinci Resolve, but not just there. If you're thinking about Topaz Video AI or some 3D like Redshift, V-Ray has some issues. I've got my V-Ray 5 working with V-Ray 6, I think, has issues. Octane render issues in there. Redshift and Cinebench, did I mention that already? Not fully supported either. You might not want to buy this now even though it's released for creators, because there's no support for that. So it's kind of good news, right? Or is it? Also, you might be wondering if it's worth buying the OC card versus a non-OC card. There is no difference for creators. Yes, if you look at, I think technically this is an OC card, maybe not. there are some cards that are overclocked, which means that they run the GPU, your GB205 in there, a little bit faster clock speeds. But when I've been testing it in terms of creative performance and creative benchmarks, honestly, there isn't that much difference at all. Within margin of error, so you don't need to pay extra just because a manufacturer is offering you, ooh, we're gonna give you an OC card, it might just consume more power and there's no difference. As a creator, just buy any card that's available. Now, before the actual benchmarks, let's talk about the test bench setup. I'm using an Intel i9 12900K. We're using DDR4 RAM that's running 3600 MHz CL18 and it's 64 GB from Kingston Fury. The motherboard is Asus Strix Z690. The cooler is Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 360mm AIO. It's pretty much an open case. For SSDs, we're using Samsung 980 Pro 1TB drive, and we've got a 1200 watt Be Quiet power supply. So yes, there is a little bit of a CPU bottleneck, but I assume a lot of you creators out there who are buying these GPUs will not have the most highest CPU system. You're not running Ryzen 9s and i9s. You're running somehow mid-range or somewhere low range, and you want to know how good is the performance there in that, scenario. So this is exactly what you're going to be seeing in here. So let's take a look at the 5070 performance now then. I've pulled out a few GPUs and tested it again. So we've got RTX 5070 from Zotac. Then we've got 5070 Ti from Zotac as well. So this is the Amp Extreme, a little bit OC version, but for creators doesn't really mean much. But now we can see what's the difference between the 5070 and Ti, because you'll realize in a minute that Ti is a whole nother breed of a card. Then we've got 4070 Super from Gigabyte, and then finally the Founders Edition RTX 3070, which is still warm because it's come directly from benchmarking. So in Geekbench 6, you can see that the 5070 Ti is 27-28% faster Vulkan and OpenCL scores. The 4070 Super is actually 3 to 8.7% faster than the new RTX 5070. So 4070 Super is actually better, and that's the actual card that the 5070 is replacing. Then we've got the RTX 3070, and that's about 27 to 30% slower compared to the 5070. Moving to AI, Geekbench 6 AI, the 5070 Ti is 10 to 14% roughly faster in single, half, and quantized scores. So quite a bit. The RTX 4070 Super is 5.6% faster in single, 8% slower in half, and 4.8% faster in quantized scores. Again, 4070 Super is faster. The 3070 is about 27 to 41% slower in these AI benchmarks, which is still not particularly impressive gain between two generations of GPUs, and that's like 4 years old now. Moving on to photo editing and Adobe Photoshop, the 5070 Ti is basically the same in overall scores. A couple of percent difference here, but exactly the same. 4070 Super is about 2% slower, but again, not that big of a difference. The 3070 here seems to have a big of a gap, and it's about 3.7% slower. Another photo editing application, Lightroom Classic, the 5070 Ti is about 1% slower. RTX 4070 Super is about 4% higher, interestingly. And then even the 3070 is about 1% faster than the 5070, which just shows me that really for Lightroom Classic, I haven't seen these particular tasks matter so much on a GPU. Even though some of the exports and putting photos together can be sometimes accelerated on a GPU, but not in this here. Now, video editing, Adobe Premiere Pro, the 5070 Ti is about the same in overall scores, but extended scores are about 5.4% faster. Probably because of the extra VRAM. That helps you with some of the larger codecs, and it's a little bit better in raw scores there, for example, as you can see. But bear in mind, Adobe Premiere Pro is not fully supporting all the media engines of the 50 series. So you can't get 4:2 10-bit codec playback on H.264 or 5 in there, because I've got the iGPU off. So we're using purely the GPU's media engines, and we're not going to see that benefit in here right now. So it's kind of like, which one is better at this massively bottleneck benchmarks in terms of the 50 series? Once these are fully unleashed, the 50 series will be a lot better than the 40 series. But here, interestingly, the 4070 Super is 2 to 4% slower in overall scores compared to the 50 series. So in photo editing, we really see a performance gain there. GPU effects about 11% slower, which is fascinating. Looking at the pure Geekbench 6, the 4070 Super was faster, but here in actual application doing some GPU effects, about 11% slower, the 4070 Super. RTX 3070 here is having quite a bad time. It's about up to 24% slower in the overall scores, about 20% slower in the extended overall scores. And the worst thing is that the GPU effects standard are about 45% slower. That's just like almost half the performance, which is massive improvement on the 5070. Moving on to After Effects, the 5070 Ti is about 4% faster, not that big of a difference. 4070 Super is about the same performance, within 1% of a difference. And RTX 3070 is about 4% slower in the overall scores. GPU score about 8.9% slower. Again, in After Effects, in these tests, GPU isn't the best, performance indicator. Moving on to DaVinci Resolve, which is a hugely GPU utilized program. 5070 Ti, interestingly, slightly slower. What's going on in here? About 1% slower in the standard overall score and about 5% slower in the extended overall score. That's ridiculous. But at the same time, long GOP scores about 70% faster on the Ti, but then massively slower on the interframe raw and even GPU effects. Even AI score is faster on the 5070. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. Is it some kind of driver issue, software? I don't know. RTX 4070 Super is about 20 to 22% slower, which is just like, what exactly is going on? And from 3070, interestingly, the 3070 is not that far behind the RTX 4070 Super. So this is a really mixed bag of a result here, and I'm just surprised what's going on. About 20% slower in the overall score, which is pretty much exactly the same as 4070 Super, 23% slower in the extended overall score, which again is about the same as 4070 Super, which is just very, very interesting. Moving on to 3D and now Blender, well, you can see that the 5070 Ti is about 21 to 30% faster in the monster, junk shop, and classroom scenes. Quite a big difference. 4070 Super is actually faster than the 5070. 8% faster in monster scene, 6% slower in junk shop scene, but again, about 8% faster in the classroom scene. So that doesn't look so good about the 5070. Now, RTX 3070 is about half the performance of the 5070. So when coming from 3070, the 5070 gives you double the performance and you get 4 GB of extra VRAM, which is nice as well. Octane Bench not yet supported exactly, Redshift not supported either, but V-Ray, we can see 5070 Ti is 16% faster in the CUDA scores, 8% faster in the RTX scores. RTX 4070 Super is interestingly 15 to 16% slower than the 5070. So interestingly here, the 3D rendering is better on the 50 series rather than the 4070 Super. And the RTX 3070 is literally almost half the performance, 46 and 50% slower in the CUDA and RTX scores. So then, conclusion, RTX 5070, what exactly has happened? Because some of these benchmarks are a bit like, wait a second, is it supposed to be good or is it bad, or is it the previous generation? Number one, the 4070 Super in most of the cases is actually better. And this 5070 Super that's supposed to replace it is not really a 5070 Super. This is really a 5065, okay? Not exactly 5060, but 5065. Somewhere between the 5060 and the 5070, which just kind of tells me that the naming for this being 5070 is not really exactly accurate, because what it's supposed to replace, there isn't that much performance difference what it's supposed to replace. The good thing about the 5070 though is that you got some media engines inside there, and the 422 10-bit H.264 and 5 now will be supported on that one. I feel like either the price should be a little bit lower, or we should get extra 4 GB of VRAM in order for this to actually kind of make sense in that price bracket. Since the 40 series isn't actually produced anymore, if the 50 series replaces the 40 series at the same price point, I think we're getting an okay deal, right? Because we're paying the same, but we just get more. But then at the same time, I wish that the previous generation was cheaper, but that's just not going to happen in here. Do I think that you're going to have good time when buying the 5070? Yes, you're going to absolutely love it, especially as a creator. Nvidia's got great support for studio drivers and creators. It's going to be stable. It's going to work in all sorts of programs, and it's just fantastic. The just downside is knowing, as a tech reviewer, the previous generation, it's not that impressive. It doesn't wow me as much as the 5090 or 5070 Ti. For example, the 5070 Ti is a whole nother beast and is a lot more ahead compared to the 5070 than I would have expected. And that's because they've got a whole different GPU die in there. This is actually cut down 5080, but this 5070, it's a whole new die. It's got less CUDA cores than the 4070 Super. Yeah, if you want to compare it to the 4070, you'll see a bigger increase, but the 4070, you can't actually buy it. Like, it's not available. And the 4070 was replaced with the 4070 Super. I'm left with a little bit of a confusion. Where is this supposed to slot? I like that it's smaller. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. As always, thank you very much guys for watching. I appreciate your support, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.